Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about Ben Shapiro. This is another follow-up to a story we covered a few days ago regarding the collapse of the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire has been bleeding subscribers nonstop for many years now, and Ben Shapiro's entire online presence appears to be in free fall, as has been documented by multiple outlets, not just mainstream sources, but many people within the political and online media space have been noticing this as well. People have been pointing out for a while now that the harder Israel pushes forward with their military actions against their neighboring countries like Gaza and Lebanon, and the harder Ben Shapiro runs defense for what many critics describe as a genocidal ethno-state or a terroristic state, the more his popularity declines in America. Obviously, there are still institutions trying to prop him up. The Daily Wire itself, which he co-founded, is one of them. They've strategically hired new talent and experimented with different approaches in an attempt to reinvigorate their brand and his brand, but none of it appears to be working at the moment. It increasingly feels like the era of Ben Shapiro as the untouchable great debater of the conservative movement is coming to an end. And frankly, Ben does not appear to be coping with that particularly well. He recently published a video addressing some of the criticism and coverage surrounding him. And in classic Ben Shapiro fashion, he immediately turned around and attacked people on his own side while blaming others for the problems he and his company are currently experiencing. Needless to say, this situation is largely self-inflicted. Ben is the one most responsible for the position he and his company now find themselves in. A major part of this decline began years ago with his unwavering and largely uncritical defense of the Israeli state, particularly as more people witnessed what has amounted to several war crimes committed by Netanyahu's government and the Israeli state in Gaza and southern Lebanon. That issue alone turned off a significant portion of his audience. Now, beyond that, one of the defining moments that further cemented Ben's loss of reputation and influence within the right wing was his speech at AmFest on December 2025. In that speech, he essentially drew a line in the sand between Israel first and America first. Ben very clearly positioned himself as the Israel first side, while figures like Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, Megyn Kelly, and Tucker Carlson found themselves on the opposite side of that divide. Notably, Ben's speech followed Erica Kirk's speech during this first AmFest after Charlie Kirk's assassination, and Ben attempted to dictate the ideological direction of the conservative movement moving forward with that speech he did. Needless to say, there was a very strong reaction to that vision from many people within this conservative America First sphere. Now, several months later, Ben increasingly finds himself isolated and on the outskirts of the conservative movement he once dominated online. Now, all that being said, Ben recently posted a video titled "All Haters Can Kiss My Ass," and not only is the video underperforming on his own YouTube channel, but when he posted clips of the video on his X, he is getting ratioed heavily in the replies. The backlash is beyond brutal. And look, at the end of the day, it's not surprising that anyone, old habits die hard. Ben Shapiro has never handled criticism particularly well. And in all honesty, he really didn't have to, because he was heavily elevated for years by this pro-Israel media and donor infrastructure that still continues trying to uphold him through conferences, institutions, and events centered around combating what is so-called anti-Zionism, which people are now trying to label as some form of anti-Semitism, all in an effort to reinforce support for Israel. But despite all that institutional backing, it increasingly appears that the broader cultural tide has completely shifted, and not in favor of Ben, the Daily Wire, or Israel for that matter. And at the end of the day, old habits die hard, because it is becoming increasingly evident that no matter how much money or infrastructure is poured into maintaining this pro-Israeli narrative, more and more people appear to have fundamentally changed their views, especially in America. And now Ben Shapiro is pushing out what can only be described as desperate levels of cope, hoping audiences will once again buy into his pro-Israel messaging and political framing of those ideas as somehow America first. But anyway, all that being said, without further ado, folks, let's start looking at the video itself and break down exactly how Ben Shapiro is responding to this growing backlash.
Well, hello, everybody. You know, sometimes here on The Ben Shapiro Show, we cover the news, and sometimes we are the news here at The Daily Wire. Well, over the past few weeks, The Daily Wire, you might have noticed, has been the subject of a bunch of hit pieces, like a veritable
hit pieces.
cornucopia of hit pieces. There was
Hit
one from
pieces.
the Washington Post, and there was one from Puck. And then finally, there was an especially ridiculous one from the stellar journalists at New York Magazine, who literally plagiarized their hit piece from the Washington Post. So much journalisming, high-level journalisming. Well, this morning, that New York Magazine piece is lighting up the interwebs. It's lighting up X. Well, New York Magazine claims there was a time when Ben Shapiro could reasonably call himself the king of all conservative media. I don't remember that time, but sounds cool. He said that's all over now.
What?
The Daily Wire is instituting significant layoffs. Ooh. Well, according to New York Magazine, the future of conservatism isn't traditional conservatism, like free markets, like equal rights before law, like checks and balances, like traditional virtue. That's done. The future, according to New York Magazine, is Nick Fuentes, confirmed Nazi stan and woman hater, and man who will never be able to get a human woman pregnant through natural means. Or Tucker Carlson, confirmed anti-capitalist and Muslim apologist and victim of demon scratching. Or maybe Candace Owens, the confirmed slanderer of widows and connoisseur of French testicles. Or maybe Megyn Kelly, click-whoring Grandma Groiper over there. Well, New York Magazine writes, quote, the collapse of the Daily Wire can be seen as a dire warning for traditional Republicans. There are two realities to Shapiro conservatism in 2026. It retains a significant foothold among Republican elites, and it is being fast rejected by the future grassroots of the parties. First of all, that's just wrong. By the polling data, the positions that we take here on the show are reflective of the broad majority of Republicans. That's just the reality. But I figured that we should address all of this head on.
Wow, this is objectively insane. This man has clearly learned nothing from his self-inflicted downfall. Right out the gate, he's already attacking people on his own side, making some truly outrageous claims. It's ad hominem after ad hominem, Nazi this, Nazi that. And of course, Ben is never actually going to address the core criticisms brought forward by the people he's criticizing, that being Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, Megyn Kelly, and Tucker Carlson. He's never going to seriously engage with the criticism surrounding the expectation of unconditional support for Israel within the Republican Party. Instead, he just dismisses everyone as extremists, anti-Semites, Nazis, or grifters without actually addressing the substance of their arguments and criticisms. Now, what's especially ironic is that Ben then turns around and claims that the positions held by the Daily Wire are representative of the overwhelming majority of Republicans. He genuinely could not sound more out of touch if he tried when he made that claim. And the reason for that is, first of all, he cites essentially one vague piece of data and then uses it as a sweeping generalization to claim, see, Republicans are still fully on our side. We represent mainstream conservatism. But again, he never properly explained what polling he's even referring to. Number two, he never specifies what issues are supposedly being supported by Republicans that the Daily Wire matches. Number three, he never actually provides meaningful evidence to substantiate the broader claim he's making here. So in the interest of presenting an actual fact-based argument, let's talk about the polling data. Let's talk about one of the most consequential decisions made by the Trump administration this year, engaging in war with Iran. Now, right off the bat, according to our own government officials, this conflict was framed as a preemptive strike. That was later further clarified by figures like Speaker Mike Johnson, Senator Tom Cotton, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio as being tied directly to the defense of Israel. The justification presented was essentially that Israel was going to attack Iran anyway, and because of that, American assets and positions in the region would be endangered. Now, the State Department later reinforced aspects of this in an April 21st memo, effectively confirming that the United States had entered this conflict largely in alignment with Israeli strategic interests. Yet afterwards, many of those same officials walked back or softened their earlier statements, while pro-Israel lobbying voices like Shapiro simultaneously insisted it was somehow anti-Semitic to even point out the obvious connection that our own officials had stated, which is ironic because the State Department later reinforced aspects of that narrative in an April 21st memo, effectively confirming that the United States had entered this conflict largely in alignment with Israeli strategic interests. All that being said, Before partisan rally around the flag dynamics fully kicked into the GOP's base, polling showed significant skepticism toward military escalation in Iran, including among Republicans. Even after the initial strikes, Quinnipiac polling showed that a majority of Republicans opposed sending U.S. ground troops into Iran, with only 37% supporting a ground invasion. Earlier polling also showed Republicans opposing broader U.S. involvement in another Middle Eastern conflict by a 53 to 35 margin. Now, yes, after the conflict officially began, support numbers shifted somewhat because most Republicans instinctively support a Republican president once military action is already underway. That's simply how partisan politics functions in a two-party system. And in many ways, it reflects exactly the sort of factional tribalism that figures like James Madison warned about centuries ago in the Federalist Papers. But even then, the support was conditional. About a month into the conflict, as I mentioned, as discussions began circulating about the possibility of a ground invasion, after the Pentagon and the Trump administration reportedly moved additional troops, destroyers, and warships into the region in preparation for this potential escalation, guess what happened? As I said, polling again showed that most Republicans opposed a ground invasion. And that matters because it demonstrates that Republican voters are not nearly as ideologically aligned with endless foreign intervention as people like Ben Shapiro pretend we are. In fact, the administration itself clearly understood how unpopular another prolonged war in the Middle East would be. That is almost certainly one of the reasons why a broader escalation never materialized and why a ceasefire arrangement was eventually pursued instead. The reality of the matter is that the president campaigned on no new wars, yet America still ended up involved in another major regional conflict abroad. He campaigned heavily on mass deportations, yet deportations have slowed dramatically. Tariff policies did not unfold in the manner in which many supporters expected. Inflation concerns remain high. Cost of living continues to rise, largely because of the war. Gas prices continue to rise and be a source of frustration, again, largely because of the war. And polling increasingly reflects growing dissatisfaction among independents and even signs of softening support within parts of the Republican base itself. Reuters Ipsos polling showed Trump's approval sinking into the mid-30s during the Iran conflict, while Financial Times focal data polling found widespread voter dissatisfaction over inflation, tariffs, and the rising cost of living. Even AP NORC polling noted declining confidence in Trump's economic leadership among Republicans themselves. Now, obviously, there are certainly still hardcore MAGA loyalists standing behind the administration no matter what. The neocons and war hawk factions, particularly those aligned with the strongly pro-Israel foreign policy positions, remain supportive as well. But to pretend that mainstream Republican voters are perfectly aligned with every aspect of the administration's current agenda is simply detached from reality. And honestly, in a political climate where the president is literally posting AI-generated imagery portraying himself as Jesus Christ, to claim that everything is perfectly stable within the Republican coalition becomes even more absurd, considering just how many Republicans, particularly Christian Republicans, pushed back against that post, which inevitably led the president to end up deleting it. All that being said, Ben Shapiro's entire argument ultimately boils down to repeatedly asserting that the data supports me, while never actually engaging with a broader reality unfolding in front of everyone's eyes. You can buy engagement, bro. We all know this. We all know the Daily Wire has been allegedly doing this. You can manipulate algorithms all you want as well. You can farm clips and reactions all day long, but most Americans are simply not where Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire currently are. Most Americans are not Israel first, and will never be. And look, in many ways, this situation actually mirrors 2015, when Ben Shapiro initially positioned himself as a never-Trumper before eventually adapting himself to the populist wave once it became politically unavoidable and Trump became president. Now, at the core of this entire issue is the attempt to redefine Republican identity around unconditional support for Israel and perpetual foreign intervention. That version of republicanism increasingly feels weak, feckless, and disconnected from the more and faster rising nationalistic, America first, Christian instincts that much of the Republican base actually is gravitating towards. So all that being said, I ask you to please keep in mind, as Ben Shapiro makes his appeal here, that he makes a living sitting behind a microphone advocating for military escalation and aggressive foreign policy on behalf of Israel. Just a few days ago, this is the same man that we saw calling for the United States to bomb Karg Island. For some reason, for Ben and the Israel Firsters, it's always American soldiers and American families expected to foot the bill on behalf of their foreign policy decisions. At some point, people are inevitably going to ask the obvious questions. If these wars are so necessary, so righteous, why are the loudest advocates for them almost never willing to personally engage and fight in these wars themselves?
So it's true. The Daily Wire laid off some 13% of our workforce since the beginning of the year. And that really sucked. It was truly sad because all those people are great. And anytime, we're in business. Anytime you lay people off as a business, that really sucks. It's tough. It's bad for them. It's bad for us. And I'm personally working to find other places of employ for as many of these people as I possibly can, because everybody who we let go deserves a job somewhere else. They're great folks. But for our critics, this was all cause for massive celebration. The joyful popping of the corks, or maybe in the case of Nick Fuentes, a victory celebration with Catboys and lubricant. And listen, we're honored by the attention.
What are you talking about, brother?
Here's the thing. People only tend to write stories like this about major American institutions, right? Like Amazon dumps people. It's a big story. Or the Washington Post dumps people, and that's a big story. And thank God we are a major American institution. According to PodTrack, our podcast reach is 41 million people per month. We're ranked 6th globally. We have a total of 11 shows. Paramount, to take an example from that same chart, is ranked 4th globally. They have 145 shows. So on a per capita basis, we're killing it. We are responsible for the 2 most successful conservative documentaries in history, Matt Walsh's Am I Racist and What is a Woman? Just this week, Vice President Vance was quoting our reporting in his fraud investigations, and our White House correspondent, Mary Margaret Olahan, is in the press room asking questions. See, here's the thing. There's no national media coverage if a top Candace Owens producer and her manager quit, or if Megyn Kelly's YouTube account starts shedding tens of thousands of subscribers a month, or if Tucker Carlson's traffic is disproportionately drawn from Pakistan. Okay, we all have our fan base. Those are all things that actually happen, by the way, but nobody really cares very much because, those people have significant audience numbers, but they don't have any real institutional influence. They are not institutions. That's not true of the Daily Wire. We're big enough that people care when we trip up. And of course, like any business, we have our ups, we have our downs. But as Mark Twain put it, the reports of our death are greatly exaggerated. But here's the thing. There's something else going on here. Something very clear going on here. The media left and the woke right, that'd be like Candace and Fuentes and Tucker and Megyn, all of them. Together, the new left, they are attempting to destroy traditional conservatism. That's the whole thing here. See, the Daily Wire is the largest traditional conservative media company in the digital space by like a ton, by leaps and bounds. We are multiple times the size of any of these others. We have lots of conversations on our platform between our various hosts about topics ranging from AI to the Middle East, on Catholicism and Judaism and all of it. There's a lot of rich disagreement here at the Daily Wire. But in the end, what we stand for here at the Daily Wire is pretty simple. Truth and virtue and freedom. And that is what the new left, meaning the old left and the horseshoe right, would love to destroy. It's why the attacks have been coming fast and furious for weeks now. They want to destroy traditional conservatism. It is their goal in life. They want to destroy it for a couple of different reasons. The left for one reason, the woke right for another. In our supposed vulnerability, people from Nick Fuentes to Tucker, from Candace Owens to New York Magazine, from the Washington Post to Megyn Kelly, they see an opportunity to supplant traditional conservatism with a conspiratorial, grievance-addled, nutty version of populism. Or, in Megyn's case, just make some quick clicks and cash. It's a lucrative grift. It's a dangerous grift for America.
There is definitely a lot going on here. He's attributing intention and motive that he really doesn't have much evidence to back up, obviously. The charge that these folks are grifters is something that gets thrown around on the internet constantly, not just toward the people Ben Shapiro mentioned, but ironically toward Ben himself as well. Pretty much anybody on the right eventually gets labeled a grifter at one point or another. In fact, that accusation is almost uniquely hurled at right-wing political commentators, cultural figures, influencers, and media personalities. People on the left very rarely receive the same accusation because left-wing audiences tend to view their influencers through a more moral lens, as though simply identifying as a leftist already constitutes some kind of moral stand. So needless to say, it is entirely dishonest that Ben Shapiro would adopt what is effectively a left-wing framing while simultaneously accusing critics of Israel of being aligned with the left. It's not smart at all that he would deploy the exact same mechanism and the exact same accusation that the left uses against conservatives, including against Ben himself, while trying to argue that these critics are somehow operating in unity with leftists. It is completely ironic that he would rely on the very tactic that he claims to oppose. And again, notice the through line. Every single person that Ben is mentioning shares one thing in common: criticism of the state of Israel. They all fall somewhere within the paleo-conservative, Pat Buchanan-style current wing of the right wing. And this is not new. As I mentioned, Pat Buchanan was deeply critical of the state of Israel decades ago. Criticism of Israel is not foreign to conservatism. What we are witnessing now is more of a reawakening or a reigniting of that older tendency within the American right. And frankly, it is understandable why that resurgence is happening in this moment in time. Israel has engaged in multiple wars and regional conflicts, and there is growing concern regarding the level of influence Israel and pro-Israel lobbying groups exert within American politics and the broader media ecosystem. Whether people agree with that criticism or not, pretending those concerns do not exist is simply blindness to reality at this point. People point directly to organizations like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, and the enormous amounts of money flowing through American politics, primarily coming through them. One of the most obvious cases recently is a congressional race involving far leftist Kat Abaguzela, where accusations circulated that AIPAC-aligned organizations and affiliated PAC structures were creating layered campaign funding operations and shell-style political infrastructure in order to heavily bankroll opposition efforts against candidates they disliked. People point to Miriam Edelson pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Trump's re-election campaign. They point to the late Sheldon Adelson, her husband, demanding meetings with Trump shortly after he entered office, and they dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into his campaign. And one of the first things they requested of Trump in that meeting was something in favor of Israel. And from the perspective of Ben's critics, all of this reinforces the argument that major conservative institutions are captured by or deeply beholden to Israeli interests. Whether Ben likes that criticism or not, that is a criticism being leveled against them and the Daily Wire and institutions that align with that side of conservatism. And speaking of capture, another thing Ben refuses to really talk about is audience capture. A huge amount of what's happening right now in these so-called podcast wars is driven by audience dynamics. People see that the Daily Wire is in a greatly weakened and disadvantaged position because of its leadership's fealty to Israel. They see audiences increasingly rejecting that message, and naturally, there is now a massive audience available to capture. And the reason that audience exists is because people increasingly feel like they cannot ignore reality anymore. That is the one thing Ben avoids addressing directly. Ironically, for all the talk he mentions here about ideological diversity and disagreement within the Daily Wire, you will almost never see someone on the Daily Wire platform fundamentally criticize Israel or any of their actions or any of their leaders by that sense. In fact, that has been one of the major criticisms directed toward figures like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles. Matt Walsh, by the way, briefly stepped over that line during the Iran conflict when he openly questioned why America was becoming involved, what the motivations actually were, and whether a foreign country should effectively be able to drag the United States into another war. And the reason that stood out so much to most folks on the internet and on X specifically is because criticism of Israel inside the Daily Wire ecosystem is unbelievably rare. So Ben can talk all day long about disagreements and internal diversity, but from the outside looking in, it is very obvious that there is a blind spot when it comes to criticizing Israel, and people believe they know why. Because institutions like the Daily Wire are funded and pushed in a specific ideological direction by Zionist donors and networks. Ben himself is an open Zionist. His media ecosystem overwhelmingly trends in that direction ideologically. It's no surprise to anyone. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories online regarding the collapse of Ben's audience numbers and engagements. In fact, there are many claims online that part of the reason his channel declined so dramatically is because of botted engagement or artificially inflated metrics. Now, whether or not that's true is beside the point because you cannot responsibly prove those allegations, but the reason people even speculate about that is because the decline appears so dramatic compared to where Ben once stood online. Now, all that being said, one truly strange aspect of Ben's response is his repeated fixation on what he frames as Nick Fuentes' alleged sexual proclivities. He keeps returning to these catboy lubricant jokes and sexual insinuations over and over again. And honestly, look, Ben, if you've got something to tell us, buddy, just say it. This is like the second or third time in this video alone that you bring this up within just a couple of minutes. It's genuinely bizarre, brother. Mentioning it once as a throwaway joke is one thing, but constantly circling back to it starts to come across as obsessive rather than substantive. Instead of engaging with the actual criticisms being made, Ben keeps trying to imply that Nick Fuentes is secretly gay or sexually deviant, as though that somehow dismantles Nick's political argument. It just makes the whole thing look desperate. It undercuts the seriousness of Ben's own position because instead of substance, he's resorting to repeated sexual insinuations and attacks. And honestly, the fact that he keeps bringing it up over and over again makes you wonder why he's so fixated on that specific fetish or topic in the first place. Additionally, Ben very desperately tries to distinguish himself and the Daily Wire from everybody criticizing him. He groups critics on the right together with the left and repeatedly invokes variations of horseshoe theory, portraying all of this as some kind of grievance-based ideological coalition trying to destroy conservatism from within. But ironically, Ben himself helped ignite much of this conflict publicly during his AmFest speech. I was there. I witnessed the entire tone of the conference shift the moment that Ben went on the offensive against Tucker, Megyn Kelly, Candace, Nick, and Steve Bannon. And by the way, while we're on that note, the whole woke right accusation is honestly a ridiculous accusation in the first place. What makes it even more ironic is that one of the people most responsible for popularizing the term in recent years is James Lindsay, someone who self-identifies as a liberal and hostile toward the populist right. Even Tim Pool has discussed how James Lindsay framed parts of the conservative right as the final boss that needed to be dismantled in American politics. So once again, Ben is borrowing rhetoric and framing from liberals and anti-conservative figures in order to attack critics on the right while simultaneously accusing those critics of importing left-wing tactics into conservatism. It is an ironic inversion of exactly what Ben claims to oppose. And this rhetoric has had real-world consequences. The woke right label is increasingly being used against people who are objectively conservative across virtually every major issue, from pro-life to pro-traditional marriage to pro-small government, pro-individual liberty. Yet many of those same figures are now being pushed out of institutional conservatism because they refuse to align themselves with these neocons who are pro-foreign engagement, endless foreign engagement, and unconditional support for Israel. I mean, I've personally experienced this myself. I've heard people attempt to associate me with individuals I've never met or publicly supported simply because narratives pushed by figures like Ben Shapiro and James Lindsay create a guilt by association environment meant to purge and ostracize people from the conservative movement. And ultimately, that is why this entire rant by Ben comes across as unbelievably disingenuous. He's accusing others of using tactics that he himself is actively deploying. He portrays himself as the reasonable institutional conservative while simultaneously resorting to guilt by association attacks, ad hominem insults, ideological purity tests, and moral smears against his critics. And frankly, this is one of the major reasons why his influence online has declined so dramatically. It is one of the major reasons why the institution he built increasingly feels weaker, less trusted, and less culturally influential than it once was. And look, all that being said, Ben, you can buy engagement all day long. You can try to manipulate optics all you want. You can lean on institutional backing and these massive Zionist donor networks. But at the end of the day, people increasingly feel that organizations like yours, the Daily Wire, are not aligned first and foremost with American interests. And that perception, whether you like it or not, buddy, is ultimately what continues driving people away from you and toward alternative voices within the conservative movement.
So why is this happening? Well, obviously, for the media left, we get it. We get it. For the media left, we get it. They're always happy to run this grift because they love a right that is crazy. They don't want a right that is characterized by normie beliefs. They want a right that's nuts, because the easiest way to make AOC president in the 2028 election is to have that nutty lady run against a conservative movement that is focused on Brigitte Macron's testicles or demon attacks in the wilds of Maine, or why the Jews are responsible for your incurable gingivitis and horrific body odor and inability to get a date. Now, as for the woke right, the new left, again, that would be Fuentes and Tucker and Candace and company. They're ecstatic about all of this for both business and political reasons. One, they're our competition. But second, they want to tear down traditional conservatism. Their whole goal is to cannibalize the traditional conservative audience. There are, by all available metrics, a hell of a lot more traditional conservatives and rational people in this country than nuts. But their goal is to gut the conservative movement and then turn it into a skin suit for their own perverse politics. That's the whole thing, which is why many of them are now coming out as Democrats. That unity is the thing. That unity is the thing. This is why Russia Today is the official outlet for the Kremlin, right? It is run by the Russian government, is retweeting Nick Fuentes' triumphalism today. Fuentes tweeted out, "I won," after that New York Magazine piece came out. That Fuentes won. Well, I don't know. Living in your basement and streaming for 8 hours a day while jacking off to the cat boys. It's a form of winning, I said.
Wow.
All right. I mean, whatever floats your boat, my dude. You might call the Russia Today Fuentes get together an online Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. Well, it's also why the Washington Post is happy to quote Candace Owens, the ranting bag lady of the internet, to explain that the Daily Wire's numbers are down. Again, that alliance between the left and the woke right is totally real, and it's active. This is why they are getting together to formulate stories. It is why they are repeating the same talking points. Now, Candace says that the Daily Wire's numbers are down because people don't want to be lectured. And this is the teenage point of view from Candace and Megyn and Tucker. They're all saying the same thing. They don't want to be lectured. Don't lecture me. Megyn tweeted in March 2026, "You're the coward, Ben, and your moral preening, priggish lectures and holier-than-thou judgments are the reason you are losing fans, and more than that, friends, at a record rate." All these people are on the same script. They're all on the same script. And also, because as people who traffic in crap for sweet, sweet lucre, they would love to be spared the lecture. They don't want to be lectured as they grift. So they're going to do the same thing that, a 13-year-old boy would do if caught doing naughty things on his iPad. They don't want to be lectured. Don't you lecture me. Well, it turns out sometimes in life, people need lectures in decency, in reason, and in truth. People who smear the wives of murdered men or cover for people who smear for the wives of murdered men. Those people deserve lectures. Maybe the people who revive Nazi propaganda. Maybe the people who have a weird interest in the non-existent testicles of the spouses of French politicians. Or maybe the people who make a cause with actual Nazi stands. Maybe those people deserve lectures. Maybe the people who are repeating talking points from Hassan Piker and mimicking the propaganda of Vladimir Putin. Or people who just randomly start cursing so much and are hanging out with the Groyper adjacent and embracing Islam. Maybe those people deserve lectures. I don't know. Well, listen, there's always a big YouTube audience for that sort of crap. But let's be real. There's a massive online audience for pornography as well. People addicted to both deserve a bit of a lecture.
This entire rant reaches a level that honestly borders on bizarre because, again, as I mentioned earlier, Ben circles back to Nick Fuentes' supposed sexual proclivities. We're talking about cat boys and lubricant jokes again, bro. Really? Why are you constantly bringing this stuff up? Why are you obsessed with this topic? I want to understand, Ben, is this something with the wife at home? Because at a certain point, you're actually painting yourself into a corner by repeatedly returning to the exact same sexualized insult over and over again. What audience is this supposed to resonate with, bro? How exactly is this meant to undermine the actual criticisms being made against you, the Israeli state? And honestly, you can tell just how upset Ben is throughout this whole segment. As the monologue continues, he grows visibly angrier. His brow gets more furrowed. His tone becomes more emotional, and he appears far less composed than he usually does publicly. Ben typically presents himself as a very calm, calculated, and controlled individual. Here, he very clearly seems irritated and emotionally affected by the entire situation. And you have to also remember that many of these people were friends, or at least are currently former friends of Ben's. He brings up Megyn Kelly, for example, and Megyn herself has publicly spoken before about being friends with Ben. So it's strange watching him spend several uninterrupted minutes doing little more than launching ad hominem attack after ad hominem attack against people he once was supposedly very friendly with. Because, folks, we just watched nearly 4 straight minutes of this, and there was essentially zero substantive engagement with the criticisms being raised by any of the figures he mentioned. Instead, Ben keeps invoking horseshoe theory and vaguely gesturing toward this idea that all of his critics are somehow converging into some extremist anti-establishment coalition, but he never actually engages with the core arguments that his critics present. Take Candace Owens as an example. Candace has one of the most popular podcasts in the entire world and discusses a huge range of topics. Yet Ben narrows the conversation down to a handful of examples in order to discredit her personally. He keeps harping on the Brigitte Macron conspiracy theory, various internet conspiracies that Candace has talked about, and Candace's scrutiny of Erica Kirk's behavior after Charlie Kirk's assassination. Now, look, I've personally criticized Candace's behavior on some of those issues myself. Now, the reason why I bring this specific criticism of Ben's logic up is because at the same time, you could easily make a parallel criticism of Ben and the way he approaches Israel, because Ben is every bit as singularly fixated on defending Israel as the people he criticizes are fixated on the issues they discuss on their podcast. This is a man who has spent years providing cover for Israel and for many of the actions carried out by the Israeli state during these conflicts. This is a state that has effectively wiped out Gaza. In fact, Israeli leaders are on the record openly discussing territorial control in Gaza and ambitions to expand operations further. You have viral clips just from this week of Benjamin Netanyahu making claims that they currently hold 60% of Gaza and they want to hold 90% of it by the end of the year. You have former IDF soldiers publicly discussing controversial actions taken during the conflict. You have actual footage of IDF soldiers literally raping Palestinian detainees. You have Israeli comedians on camera doing crowd work with former Israeli soldiers and joking about the level of abuse those soldiers perpetuated on Palestinians. You have members of the Knesset and figures associated with Israeli politics making inflammatory comments that have gone massively viral. Those comments minimizing acts of sexual violence and abuse being perpetuated by the IDF, and to an extreme degree, even advocacy on behalf of the conduct becoming a wartime policy for the IDF. And this is precisely why Ben's critics argue that he refuses to honestly engage with the substance of what people are reacting to. Because look, at the end of the day, the same criticism Ben launches at the so-called woke right could just as easily be launched back at him. He accuses everyone else of ideological obsession while being completely incapable of critically addressing Israel, IDF's malfeasances, the malfeasances of Israeli leaders, and all of it, everything attached to it in any sort of meaningful way. Why is Ben incapable of seriously engaging with the allegations of war crimes by the Israeli military? Why is there never any real scrutiny from Ben toward the conduct of Israel, despite the overwhelming amount of footage, testimony, statements, and reporting surrounding these war crimes in Gaza and Lebanon? And honestly, I think this goes without saying. If Ben Shapiro were ever willing to genuinely engage with these videos, these statements, and these controversies directly, if he were willing to honestly discuss controversial actions by the Israeli government and the IDF, or critically evaluate statements made by people like Netanyahu, it would probably become the singular most popular thing he has done in many years. If Ben actually sat down and did a serious long-form discussion or a reaction stream where he openly and honestly engaged with these criticisms, instead of instantly dismissing all of this stuff as anti-Semitism, as extremism, as a blood libel, it would immediately restore a tremendous amount of credibility for him within large sections of the conservative movement. It would also help restore faith in the Daily Wire as an institution that is actually willing to approach controversial subjects fairly and honestly. Until then, though, many people increasingly are going to view the Daily Wire as an institution that will continue to lose relevance at a faster and faster pace, especially as more disturbing images continue emerging from Gaza and Lebanon at the hands of Israel.
But let's get back to the central issue. The point of the attacks on the Daily Wire is, of course, not just to attack the Daily Wire. It's to destroy traditional conservatism. That's the whole thing, the entire thing, all of it, every bit of it. That's the whole thing. The reason they're coming after the Daily Wire is because they want to come after you. They want to come after traditional conservatives who believe traditionally conservative things. It is no coincidence that at the same time, the Washington Post and New York Magazine and all the rest of these legacy left publications are attacking the Daily Wire. They're also writing strange new respect features on Nick Fuentes and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson. The left wants those people to win. By the way, they're not hiding it very well. New York Magazine's piece says, quote, like the Rockefeller Republican of yore, the Shapiro Republican could go extinct entirely. That's what they want, right? They want traditional normie Republicans to go away. It's what they want, and it's what they hope for.
No.
And listen, maybe it will turn out that all these people who hate conservatism and what I consider to be traditional American principles, maybe they're right. Maybe it'll turn out that the future of the right, perverted by the algorithmic insanity of the internet, is sloppulism. You know, the Tucker-style grievance conspiracism, complete with the night-scratching demons, or Candace Owens' usual brand of kookery, or Nick Fuentes' transgressive Nazi cosplay, or Theo Vaughn's man-child podcast illiteracy. Maybe that's where the right goes. Maybe that's what comes next. Maybe that's all facilitated by the click whoring of the Megyn Kellys of the world and justified by an appeal to audience numbers, because none of these people ever appeal to morality. They just point to their clicks. Maybe Idiocracy wasn't a satire. Maybe it was a prophetic documentary. But here's the thing, from where I sit, that does not change one single thing for me. Not a single thing. See, here's the thing. I've been doing this since I was 17 years old. I started off when I was 17 years old writing a syndicated column on politics. I didn't do that because I wanted to get rich that way. That's not how you get rich. I got into politics because I cared about the truth, about saying things that I believe to be eternal and true, because I care about the ideas of conservatism. It's why I've done that for all these years. I care about free markets, and I care about private property, and I care about equal rights before the law, and checks and balances, and the Constitution. I care about all of those things. I care about the America that the founders promised us, and the America that our parents and grandparents fought and worked for. And I'm not going to lie for cash. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to tell you about the wonders of Moscow supermarkets or the glories of Sharia law in Qatar. I'm not going to pander for clicks by pretending that Erica Kirk might have been complicit in Charlie Kirk's murder, or that perverse and malicious questions about TPUSA's cover-up are somehow a bizarre form of investigative journalism. I'm not going to wink and nod at the transgressiveness of the Nazi incels, or chuckle along with people who pretend that a conspiratorial elite are the reason your life isn't everything that you want it to be. In the freest and most prosperous country in world history, I'm going to be grateful for America, and I'm going to point out what's great about America and what our principles are. I'm not going to do any of that other stuff, because here's the thing. I got into this business to do precisely the opposite. I haven't changed my principles. I've been doing this for 25 years. I have not changed my principles. Now, there's a question that I get a lot these days, a lot. From friends, from family. People will come up and they'll say, what happened to all these people? Yeah, they understand New York Magazine and Washington Post and what they are, but what happened to, Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly and all the rest? And I don't know the answer because I'm not a psychiatrist. But here's what I do know. Nobody has ever asked that question about me. No one, because my worldview has not changed. It has not changed. My principles haven't changed because I think those principles are true and good. And those principles are not going to change. So in the end, take it or leave it. If people decide they don't want to hear it, it's a free country. That's their choice. But I am willing to bet my future and the future of America that more Americans agree with me than agree with the people who want to destroy the Daily Wire. I'm betting there are a lot more rational people in this country than conspiracy-mongering nut jobs. And again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm betting that there are way more people in America who believe in truth and virtue and freedom than people who revel in grievance and demoralization and stupidity. Maybe we lose. But here's the thing. That also doesn't change a thing. It doesn't change a thing. It doesn't matter. Because the only thing that matters is the only thing that has ever mattered to me. Speaking the truth, whether people like it or whether they don't.
You don't
Because
speak the
facts
truth,
still
though, brother.
don't care about your feelings. This is the Ben Shapiro Show.
It's over. You can tell it's over. And honestly, I think even Ben himself knows it's over. This entire rant feels like a desperate last-ditch effort to save both his reputation and his relevance. But you can very clearly tell that he's losing his battle culturally and politically. And one of the most ironic parts of this whole thing is the way he tries to frame his refusal to change as some kind of moral virtue. He repeatedly says, I haven't changed, while insisting that everybody else around him has changed. But here's the thing. Most of these people haven't really fundamentally changed either. They're still broadly the same types of conservatives they were before. If anything, in the case of Megyn Kelly, I would actually argue that she has become more conservative after leaving Fox News. If you remember, during Trump's first run, Megyn was openly confronting him during one of the debates, using what was understandably characterized at the time as feminist talking points. There was a very public clash around that entire interaction. And nowadays, I seriously doubt Megyn Kelly would approach Trump in that same way. Maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt she would still frame those issues through the same lens she once did. And that's what makes Ben's argument ironic. The reason Ben hasn't changed is not necessarily because he's uniquely principled or virtuous. It's because he has a massive blind spot. And that blind spot is precisely the area where he should change. Because as long as he remains completely unwilling to critically examine the actions of the Israeli state and instead continues defending its unconditionally, no matter what happens, his reputation and credibility are inevitably going to continue taking damage alongside the actions of Israel. So change is not inherently bad, and stubbornly refusing to reevaluate your position is not automatically virtuous either. In fact, obstinance can become deeply destructive when your principles are effectively being used to provide moral cover for what many Americans increasingly view as a genocidal state. In fact, you could apply the exact same logic historically to terrible regimes and ideologies. You could say that Nazis in Germany never changed their principles either. Guess what? They still did horrific things. Simply remaining consistent in your beliefs does not automatically make those beliefs righteous. It doesn't make you virtuous. Consistency alone is not a great moral defense, Ben. I'd expect better from you. So when Ben appeals to virtue by saying, I haven't changed, it really does not land the way he thinks it does. It doesn't come across as noble at all. It comes across as stubborn, disconnected, and increasingly out of touch with the broader American public and the mood around Israel and those topics. Beyond that, another thing Ben attempts to do throughout this rant is frame himself as though larger forces are coming after him and by extension coming after the audience itself. But no, not really. Let's be honest here. Most Americans do not care about Ben Shapiro nearly as much as Ben Shapiro thinks they do. And I can say that confidently from actual experience talking to voters in my district, door knocking and speaking with ordinary Americans every single day. Most people care about whether they can afford groceries. They care about paying too much in taxes. They care about that tax money being wastefully spent, about corruption, crime, public safety, inflation, and the cost of living going up endlessly. They're not emotionally invested in the personal fate of Ben Shapiro. They don't really give a shit about Ben Shapiro, to be honest with you, because Ben Shapiro is replaceable. The same way I'm replaceable. The same way Nick Fuentes, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, they're all replaceable too. The same way virtually every online commentator is absolutely replaceable. We've seen this cycle happen over and over and over again. Public figures rise, public figures fall. And ultimately, the marketplace of ideas decides which message resonates and which ones do not. Now, yes, obviously, institutions and lobbying groups can astroturf support, they can buy engagement, they can amplify certain narratives, they can promote preferred speakers and place people into positions of prominence. The Israel lobby has been doing that for years, but at the end of the day, the American public still decides which messages emotionally and politically resonate with them over time. And frankly, Ben Shapiro, the Daily Wire, and their broader institutional conservative message simply are not resonating the way they once did. Because guess what, guys? You suck. And until you are willing to have an honest conversation about Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, people are going to continue rejecting your message. And look, I'm not saying this in any sort of emotional way. There's actual polling data and trend data backing everything I set up. Public support for Israel in the United States has declined dramatically, especially among younger generations. Polling increasingly shows support for Israel at historic lows among Gen Z, younger millennials, independents, and even softening among the boomers. The last numbers I saw, in fact, had support sitting somewhere in the low 30s overall, which is historically terrible compared to where it once was. See, a growing percentage of younger Americans increasingly favor distancing the United States from Israel entirely or radically reevaluating that relationship. Our greatest ally is no longer seen as our greatest ally, okay? That trend is real. Whether people like it or not, whether Ben wants to admit to it or not. So if Ben truly wants to reconnect with the audience he claims to represent, then maybe he should actually uphold the principles he constantly says he believes in and start engaging in honesty, in truth, with these issues on his platform. Talk honestly about the bombing campaigns perpetuated by Israel, which the United Nations has described as indiscriminate bombing. Talk honestly about all the unnecessary civilian casualties, all the child amputees. Talk honestly about the destruction taking place in Christian communities in Lebanon. Talk honestly about the controversies surrounding the Israeli military operations and the growing international backlash over how Israel and Netanyahu are choosing to conduct themselves in this war scenario. Because until institutions like the Daily Wire are willing to have those conversations honestly and openly, most Americans are going to continue viewing them as institutions more interested in protecting a narrative and protecting their donors and protecting a foreign state than actually pursuing the truth, as Ben disingenuously claims here, okay? Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. I hope you have a terrific day. Peace.